This is the first episode I'm doing in English, and I have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Andrew Miller, bachelor's degree by Wayne University in secondary education, social studies, scoring a perfect 4 out of 4 on his Michigan test for teacher certification, master's degrees from New York University, Buffalo State in multidisciplinary studies in teaching, over 7 years of teaching at American schools in Mexico, mostly US history and AP US history. Mr. Miller, thank you very much for coming here to the podcast.
I feel honored to be here. Thank you very much. You were always a star student of mine, so I'm very happy to participate in this discussion with you.
Thank you very much. You were also one of my favorite teachers. First question, Mr. What's your background and why did you decide to move from Michigan all the way to sunny Mexico?
Well, my background is in social studies. I'm a real nerd when it comes to social studies and history. While other people are playing with their phones and doing things like that, I like to read history books, sometimes 4 or 5 times. Um, I meet people all the time who, in the United States, we have a lot of foreigners, and I'll meet foreigners all the time from all parts of the world, and I'll get into discussions with them, and they'll tell me, "Wow, you know more about my country than I do." Uh, I've scored perfect scores on my Michigan teaching certification tests in history and social studies, perfect scores. These are like 300 question exams. I've met other teachers who failed them 2 or 3 times before they finally passed them and got their certification. I got perfect scores on my first try. I'm gloating a little bit, but I think I have the right to. When you're good at something, why not proclaim it? Um, and I had the pleasure of teaching AP US history to Mexican students whose second language was English. And as you know, with AP US history, there's a lot of essay writing and reading of complicated historical texts. And my students every year were scoring in the top 5% of all global scores, including you, my friend. And that's something I'm very proud of, and that you guys should be proud of too. A lot of even really good schools here in the United States, the students in that type of class usually don't score that high. So you can be proud of that, and so can I. And that really stands out on a resume, more than even like a high GPA. Scoring very high on an AP exam really stands out on a university application and a job resume. So keep that in mind as you're finishing college and submitting resumes all over the place. I got into international teaching in Mexico because, well, number one, I was dating a girl from Mexico when I jumped into it. So I have to admit, I was kind of pulled down there because of a relationship with a girl in Torreon. Uh, and that's the first reason I went to Mexico, I got to admit. The second reason, as a social studies person, I was really interested in going to other countries and not just visiting as a tourist for 2 weeks and going to all the tourist traps, but to actually be submersed in the culture and to see it. And this girl I had dated in Mexico, she worked in the United States, and she was always going back and forth between Torreon and Detroit. So I kind of started doing that too with her before I actually started working in Mexico. So I was already kind of familiar with Mexico, um, and learned to love Mexico pretty early on. Uh, and then ultimately, I found out about the international teaching scene and how there's this whole network of really good international schools throughout Latin America, especially Mexico, that are ideal academic settings, in my opinion. Uh, so I started trying that out, and then I found Tampico because Tampico, in order to keep American teachers around for a few years, um, dangled a little carrot in front of us called a master's program that they would sponsor and pay for. So how can you say no to that? You're
Yes.
basically getting a free master's degree while you're working and getting paid in an ideal work environment, in my opinion. So that's how I got into teaching in Mexico. And of course, I just love the atmosphere. The students at those kind of schools are really hardworking, inquisitive people from really good families with good values, um, who are very respectful and serious about their learning, but also not so serious in the sense that they're laid back and love to have fun. In my opinion, it's an ideal work environment. But I ultimately had to decide if I'm going to stay there any longer. Um, it becomes a life decision at my age. If you're going to work in overseas for more than 6 or 7 years, pretty soon you have to realize you're not paying into the American social security and retirement system. So what are you doing? You have to decide, are you going to just become a permanent expatriate and live in Mexico for the rest of your life, or was this just something, a step in life that you've taken to help you grow, but then you have to return to the United States? I decided to return during the pandemic because I had achieved my initial goals, like getting a lot of good teaching experience, getting those high AP scores that I can show on my resume, um, getting my master's degree, uh, and just building up my skills and my profession. And then when the pandemic came, it was kind of like, all right, I achieved the goals that I set out to do. It's been a great ride. And when the pandemic first came, nobody knew how serious it was going to be. I think a lot of people panicked at first. And I wasn't sure if it was a good idea to be in a developing country while all that stuff was going on and people were talking about travel restrictions and that kind of thing. So I just felt like it was time to come back.
Sure, sure. And when you first arrived to Tampico, what was it like being an American? Was there like a huge culture shock? What's the like? What was your first experience with?
Well, before I had entered the scene in Tampico, I had already entered the scene in Torreon. So I would say that any culture shock I had as an American adjusting to Mexican culture probably happened in Torreon. By the time I came to Tampico, I was already pretty used to Mexican culture. Although I must say the humidity shocked me. Um, but I would say probably one of the biggest culture shocks I found was I felt sometimes uh, that Mexican people were a little bit, uh, they reminded me a little bit of deer,
Okay.
okay, in the sense where I live in Michigan, there's a lot of deer. So we're used to seeing deer. Very curious, but also very skittish. Like if they, like a deer, when you're out in the woods, if you're walking in the woods and you see a deer and the deer sees you, it won't run away right away. It's curious, like, who are you, what are you doing here in my woods? And kind of like looking at you and trying to figure out what you're all about, and very curious in a social way. But if you step on something like and that snaps a stick or makes a noise, all of a sudden that deer jumps up and runs away. I found that Mexican people, in my opinion, were somewhat, they kind of reminded me of deer. Very, very curious, but also very skittish sometimes.
Sure. I guess that it's it's also interesting because like with all due respect, you don't look like the average Mexican, right? You're like what, like 6'3"
Six
and
four, yeah.
6'4". So it's something of a culture shock for the average Mexican to see an American living in Mexico and in a such specific city as Tampico, you know?
Right, right.
And like in your experience, how do you how are like your students back in the US similar to the ones in Mexico, or like do you find any similarities?
There's similarities in the sense that some they make a lot of the same references to pop culture, to YouTube videos. Um, I'm trying to think of a YouTube. Oh, damn Daniel. Kids in America, high school students in America will reference things like that, just as the English-speaking kids and even the Spanish-speaking kids in Mexico know what that is. They're telling jokes about. So in some sense, there's the same cultural references and dialogue happening. Um, but there's differences also. Mexican students, I think, are a lot more respectful. American students, one of the things about American people is they speak very, very directly, and they're very, very individualistic. And there's much more resistance with American people when it comes to going along with something. Americans kind of like to stand out and do what they want to do as individuals. And so sometimes Americans can be tougher to deal with as a teacher.
Okay, I guess that's part of the American values, no? Like being independent, autonomous. That's why people prefer to drive their cars and wait for the bus, no? Because
Right.
you have the freedom to hit the road whenever you want.
The automobile is the perfect material expression of Americanism. It's a manifestation of American individualism. The idea that you can get up and go wherever you want to go uh, without relying on someone else, or sharing that ability with someone else. That it's for you, so that you can do what you want. Yeah.
But it's like a paradox, right? Because in one way, Americans are really independent, but on the other ones, they're really, really good at the military. So you have to be part of the team, but then again, you're individual. So it's weird, no? It's like the
Yeah.
contrasts.
It's a double dynamic for sure. Yeah, that exists in all cultures, I think. There's some kind of double dynamic. Here's another observation about Mexicans. One of the very first things I noticed entering Mexico and living in Mexico is the Mexican cultural emphasis on politeness and rudeness. Mexican people take things that are considered rude very seriously. It's a very bad thing to do things that might be considered rude in Mexico. That was my feeling. For example, good guy wrestlers are called technicos because they have good technique. Bad guy wrestlers are called rudos because they're rude. Um, Again, American individuality, Americans tend to speak their mind and speak very directly. Whereas in Mexico, when people speak, sometimes they restrain what they want to say, I think, because they don't want it to be interpreted as rude. Mexican people are just very concerned about, not being rude. And I hear Mexican people saying it all the time. Maybe Mexicans don't really realize it, but as a foreigner living in Mexico, I realized it right away, and I still do. But at the same time, with all this concernedness about being polite and not being rude, there's another side of it that I just don't understand. Like in an office environment in Mexico, the overweight guy, people at the office just call him Gordo. And it's like no big deal. Oh, hey Gordo, can you bring me those copies? And it's like, wait a second, as a foreigner, I'm watching this and I'm saying, I don't understand. Mexican people are so concerned with politeness and rudeness. And yet at the same time, everyone's just calling the overweight guy Gordo. I don't understand. Isn't that rude? But I guess in some ways, if you know the person, it's like affectionate to call him Gordo. But as a foreigner, it's hard to understand. These people are very concerned and on guard all the time about not being rude, and yet they're calling this guy Gordo like it's nothing. So And in a society like Mexico, where everyone's so polite when they're speaking to each other, they never get into business right away. The conversation is always social first before it turns into business. Whereas in the United States, if you need to do something and you're waiting in line and it's finally your turn, you get into business right away, or you need to call someone up and talk about business, you get to it right away. Americans are always in more of a rush, and again, more direct. But in Mexico, there's this thing like, wait a minute, tell me about your weekend, tell me about your family. Okay. And then 10 minutes later, okay, so the reason I'm here is because I need to do this, this, and this. That's another noticeable difference too. But it's funny, in Mexico, you see this double dynamic where there's this extra emphasis on being polite, but you don't see that when you're driving. Everyone's rude when you're driving. So there's this interesting dichotomy that I notice in Mexican culture.
I guess that, and I've thought of this before. That it's so true in America. You start a business and it's right away, because mostly the legal system, it's awesome and it's not that expensive to go and sue somebody really quick. They made it that way to be efficient. Whereas in Mexico, you sometimes don't know who you're dealing with, and if
Yeah.
they're gonna scam you or everything. And that's important for us to know the person before, because well, our legal system's not that great, so we have to count on the other person word, right? That's
And figuring out when you meet someone new how they fit into the community, and introducing yourself not just with your common street name that everybody who knows you calls you, Juanito. It's important to say your full name with your mother's last name and your father's last name, so that the person you're introducing yourself to can think for a moment about who else they know who might be related to you, and how you fit into the community, and maybe even to some degree what social class you're a part of, before they have to understand who you are before they're ready to actually start talking about business.
do you saw more social hierarchies here in Mexico than the US?
Say that again.
Do you saw or experience like more social hierarchies than in the US?
If I spoke Spanish and understood everything that people were saying in Spanish, I probably would have noticed that more. As a foreigner who really only spoke English, I mean, I can speak Spanish, but it's terrible. I don't, and when I hear people speaking Spanish, I can basically understand what the topic is, but beyond that, I get lost pretty easily. So basically, for me, as a guy who really only speaks English, even though I lived in Mexico quite a while, that's another interesting thing. Mexico's probably, they're like, if I had gone to Thailand or some other place, I wouldn't have been able to survive that long without learning the language. But in Mexico, I could survive pretty well, even though I wasn't speaking Spanish, just because there are so many, like 1 out of every 6 people can speak basic English in Mexico. I can even go to some small puebla somewhere and, uh, ask for directions somewhere, and the first person I speak to might not speak English. Oh, hey, go ask this guy here. He was an illegal immigrant for 5 years. He speaks some English. So, but I think like if I spoke good Spanish and understood good Spanish, I would have probably noticed more details like that about social hierarchy. But as a foreigner, um, I suppose that just didn't stand out to me as much. I know it's there though. I know that it's there, that there is um, more of a structured social class system in Mexico. And would you say that speaking English is a characteristic of a higher social class?
I would say that, yeah, of course.
Mhm.
It's we love in Mexico people that are foreigners. I think
Mhm.
that's being a huge part of our culture, because in a sense we still have the conquered mentality. We think that the Spaniards came here to conquer us. We think that, like, we tend to victimize ourselves, like the Mexican American War. But at the end of the day, it's like we praise them because broad industry or whatever. But I think it's more like the government wanting us to be a victim because Spaniards didn't actually came to conquer us. We're a mixed race, and they didn't conquer Mexico. They conquered the Aztecs. So it's those kinds of things. But going back to your question, knowing English does put you in a higher social hierarchy because it means that you're well traveled, I guess.
Uh-huh. I did notice sometimes where, I could just be like in an HEB or a grocery store, and the guy working behind the meat counter is sitting there and he's bored and there's no customers, and he'd see me walking down the aisle, be like, "Hey man, are you American?" And he'd start speaking English to me, and even though it wasn't very good English, as soon as like I'd start to talk to him, he'd get the attention of the other workers and point at me because he wanted the other workers to see him speaking English with me. And they'd all go, oh, they would be going out of their way to show people that they could speak English, even though their English wasn't really that good. I always would get a kick out of that. I saw that all the time.
Of course, it's a flex. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, I do speak English, and let me show it to your face,
Yes, it's a flex. You're right. It's a flex.
But it's a subtle flex because the guy that meat, the guy that was selling you meat, he like subtly, like his intentions were like, I'm friendly, but if you go way down, it's like, yeah, I can speak English and you can't, you know.
Hey, we can turn what you brought up into something real juicy here, and provocative, um, which is what I like to do. I like to challenge people a little bit. You were just mentioning the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs, and I like to pose a question, and you might even remember this. As soon as we get into the conquistadors, I might say, well, wait a minute, did Cortez conquer Mexico?
Of course not, Mister.
Or did he liberate Mexico? Did he liberate Mexico? And someone in the audience will say, oh, you can't say that. Oh, the Spanish were so cruel. The encomienda system was horrible. I say, yes, it was. There was definitely some exploitation. But what were the Aztecs doing?
Oh, it's true.
What
What
were
do
the
you think?
Aztecs doing? The Aztecs were never a majority of the Mexican indigenous population. They were a minority. They were a very violent and aggressive minority that conquered and subjugated a larger multiple groups of indigenous tribes around them. And they made them pay tribute every year. And that was either in food or goods, and most especially human sacrificial victims. And at the consecration of the big temple in Teotihuacan or wherever, just a couple of years before Cortez came to Veracruz, at the consecration of that temple, the Aztecs sacrificed more than 80,000 human beings. There was literally a line of people from the central pyramid in the city going all through the city out into the countryside, just people stepping forward like you're at the airport, waiting in line to go up to the pyramid and be sacrificed. And when Cortez lands at Veracruz, some of the first Indians he meets, when they see his technology and his horses, they are literally falling on their knees saying, thank God you're here. The Aztecs were just here a week ago taking, 30 people out of our village, including my own daughter, to go be sacrificed. Can you help us, please? And the Aztecs would sacrifice them. And it wasn't just cutting out their hearts, it was taking their corpses, cutting off their arms, their heads, sticking them on spikes, and putting these things all around their empire. There were roads where they had corpses and heads on spikes to intimidate people. and to show the other indigenous tribes, we're the Aztecs, we're in charge, don't you dare question us. I wonder where the narcos and some of the things that they do when they kill people and make these grotesque displays out of their bodies, hanging them from bridges and overpasses. I wonder where the narcos got that idea from. So
And
I like to challenge people when we talk about Mexican history. When I first hear, oh, Cortez conquered Mexico, he conquered Mexico and subjugated the Indians. I'm not denying that, but I also like to challenge that narrative and say, but did he also liberate Mexico from the tyranny and the violence of the Aztecs?
from then, like you from an outsider point of view and knowing a lot about history, why do you think a government will try to romanticize Aztecs and not go with the other side of the story?
Well, it's the Mexican version of political correctness, but I think some of it is justified. I think throughout most Latin American history, indigenous people were looked down upon. That's undeniable. And you know, historically, a lot of the indigenous communities, were deprived of a lot of opportunities, and so it's an effort. It's an effort to a get votes, but B also to try to compensate for some mistakes that were made, which are undeniable. I'm not denying that those mistakes were made. And so I think it's an effort of reconciliation. Sometimes it might go too far, sometimes it might seem a little bit ridiculous, but I think some of the intent there is good.
Sure. Going back to your background and well, your extensive knowledge and educational preparation in history and in teaching history. What's the importance right now of understanding history in a world where technology and engineering degrees they're getting really popular?
Hmm. Um, I think I guess the first thing I would voice is a concern because you're talking about technology, and I'm thinking of smartphones and social media and the way it's changing our society so quickly, and just knowing how much danger there is associated with that when it falls into the wrong hands, or control of those systems fall into the wrong hands, which they already have, and will and you'll see it more and more. Um, I guess I'm focused a little bit more on, I guess maybe some concerns have been brought up in the United States recently about, censorship on social media, deplatforming people. With social media and the internet now being, one of the main modes of communicating information, um, what used to be an open free market of information, is now being censored and more tightly controlled now, um, by groups like Facebook and Twitter and whatnot. If you say something that goes against their narrative, there's an emerging tendency now to deplatform people and control the dissemination of information. And I think you're going to see that more and more. And what I find especially scary is seeing how a company like Google, that is arguably one of the most powerful entities in the world now, works with a repressive government like China and helps them implement systems where they can monitor what everyone's doing through their phones and the internet, and how they have cameras everywhere in China that can do facial recognition. And even if you're jaywalking down the street, the camera recognizes your face and puts a little tag on your account. They have a database where they have everyone's information, and they recognize your face. And if you're jaywalking, they immediately know who you are, just all automated through the computer system, and they can mark down your social credit score. And how everyone, like in a place like China, and I'm saying this because it will come to other places. China's just the proving ground. These big corporations are developing these systems in China where the Chinese government essentially says, you can come here and do what you want and we won't interfere. We need you to do this for us though. And the catch is, though, in 10 years, you have to share all your patents with us so we can copy your technology. But just seeing things like where people in China to use the internet have to get registered, and they have to scan their faces, and then if they go to the store and they buy beer, if the computer system thinks, oh, you're drinking too much, we're going to mark down your social credit score, or you haven't hit the like button enough on the Chinese government propaganda that's put out on the internet in China on their social media sites. You're not hitting the like button enough when you see government propaganda. So we're going to, or you liked something that the official Chinese Communist Party doesn't agree with, and you hit the like button, and we're watching and we're tracking. So that's going to lower your social credit score. So it's just like a credit card almost, where you get a credit score. And if you have a really good credit score, you can get loans and the interest rates are low. China has things like a social credit score. If you're doing something that the Chinese government doesn't promote or doesn't approve of, your social credit score goes down, and sooner or later that will affect your ability to travel. If you want to get on an airplane and go visit another area of China or leave the country and go to Thailand, they won't let you. They won't issue you the pass to travel. You won't be able to get loans. You'll be taken off the list of eligibility to get into certain universities or to get certain jobs. So with technology, we have to just be very careful, seeing how control freaks, i.e., big government, wants to use it to spy on people and control people's behaviors. It's already happening. China's the perfect example. The big tech companies are developing these systems in China because they have a cooperative government that wants these systems. And sooner or later, you'll start seeing the same systems appear in other countries. You will, I promise.
Before
You
going
already are. We already are.
sorry, into the China topic, I would like to focus in when you mentioned on like the platforming and how big tech companies like Facebook and Twitter, they're censoring others. But isn't that like good in a way? It's a check and balance because usually the big tech companies, they're Democrat, and for a long time Republicans, they really had strong institutions. They have oil, they have the Koch brothers, they have the NRA. They have these really strong institutions that Democrats didn't have before. So eh, of course it's not good like for you to be like censoring others, but isn't it a check and
Like a
balance,
balance. It's
aha,
a
between
balance.
the two forces, no, the two bipartisan forces in the US?
I disagree, because it's suppression of free speech and dialogue. And I disagree that Democrats don't control important institutions. They definitely do. They control the school system. They control the public school system. They control the universities. Academia is controlled by the left. Public schools, even down to the elementary school level, is controlled by the left. Hollywood and most of pop culture is controlled by the left. So I think they have a lot of power, and most of it is over how information is shared. In my opinion, they have almost a total monopoly.
Sure. And it's a hard question, but in a country with bipartisanship, sorry, how can and can Democrat and Republican politicians unite in order to find common grounds or shared values. I guess that every American wants a stable job, some kind
Hmm.
of like, you know, safety again. It's just maybe that the questions they're not properly spoken, no?
I mean, I definitely think that the different sides of the political spectrum do have common ground where they should be cooperating. One of the best examples I can think of is during President Trump's term as president. One of the things he spoke a lot about was lowering the cost of prescription drugs. Um, America, the American medical system overprescribes prescription drugs. Um, and a lot of people are dependent on prescription drugs, and the costs are very high. And the big pharmaceutical companies are taking advantage of that for sure. And Democrats and Republicans can both agree with that. So you have a guy like Donald Trump talking about that and how that needs to be fixed. And at the very opposite end of the political spectrum, you have a guy like Bernie Sanders saying the same thing. It would have been very nice, I think, under the Trump presidency for like if Bernie Sanders or his faction were to actually sit down with the Trump faction and say, look, I disagree with you on about 85% of most issues, but we do have an overlapping common interest when it comes to lowering the price of prescription drugs. So why don't we set up a bipartisan committee with Bernie Sanders and a couple of very liberal Democrats, and if you like um, business-minded Republicans who really understand negotiating in the business world, and let's work together to put pressure on big pharmaceutical companies to lower prescription drug prices. And it would have been nice to see something like that, but we didn't see that. Yeah, the United States is very polarized right now. It has been for a while. And I think social media plays a big role in that. Um, as social media becomes more and more intertwined with our lives and our communication and our thinking, I think you will continue to see more polarization. The reason being is so many people get their information now through their phones and through different websites and social media sites. And when you are skimming through Facebook or Twitter or whatever it is you're looking at, and you see an article that you like, and you open it up and read it, that program, Twitter or Facebook, is keeping a record, and they're saying, okay, this user likes this topic or likes this narrative. So to get you to open more articles and hit the like button more often, they keep sending you more and more information that follows that viewpoint, because they know that when they can insert advertising into those articles, you're more likely to read that advertising. So if I know that Carlos is really big on legalization of marijuana, and he's skimming through some articles, and he says, oh, legalization of pot in Colorado, and he opens up that article and reads it and likes it and maybe even hits the like button. Facebook is tracking that, so they're saying, oh, send him more information that is pro legalization. And so you're no longer seeing arguments that are saying, hey, wait a minute, slow down. There might be some dangers with legalization of drugs. They're only sending you more and more stuff that is intensely pro legalization. So pretty soon, your reality is becoming very skewed, because the only information that's being sent to you, the only information popping up on your screen when you sign in, is stuff that is very, very pro legalization. And I'm not arguing against legalization. I'm just simply saying that once you start viewing things and once you start hitting the like buttons, the algorithms start sending you more and more of that. So pretty soon, people are spending hours and hours a day on the internet or on their phones, and pretty soon all the information they're seeing is calculated information. Send him stuff that we know he'll open and read. And so pretty soon your reality is just getting information from that one viewpoint more and more and more. So you're not going to see, a small group on the right and a small group on the left and most people in the center. If everyone's getting sent stuff that the algorithms know they like, pretty soon the middle shrinks and you have this. You have a large extreme right and a large extreme left and a very small center. Do you see
Oh,
what I mean?
of course.
So from going like what used to be this with a large center and very small extremes on both sides, you're getting this with a small center and larger extremes on both sides. Does that make sense?
No, of course, I totally agree. We're getting a confirmation bias every day of our ideologies, and that's
Mhm.
making us more radical, which is it's interesting, but it's also really, really dangerous in
Oh, yes.
sense. And
Yes.
and as you're mentioning, we're watching or hearing the same information because we're in the same Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, whatever. And and you're like when I asked you before, what were the similarities between your American students and your Mexican? Is that like we had the same pop culture, so it's like is culture dying? Are we getting like homogenized in a way that we all know the same jokes, we all know the same videos? It's weird, no?
It's weird. Humanity is going through a very, very rapid change right now, and it's hard for a lot of us to see it, especially younger people.
And going back to healthcare and to health that you mentioned, for an outsider like me, I don't really understand why is universal healthcare a controversial issue in America. Uh, like, why would an American not want free healthcare? And is it related to not wanting big government spending? Is it more related to like not having a socialist ideology? What's your
It's all of those things. It's a combination of things. It challenges that whole concept of rugged individualism. You get health insurance because you work hard enough and you're smart enough to land a good job, because there are jobs here. We have a strong economy and opportunity. So um, when you're and I'm probably oversimplifying this, okay? But I'm just trying to keep it simple. So a lot of people will look at it and say, well, if you're a no good deadbeat, you don't deserve to have other people, you don't deserve to have the taxpayer paying for all of your expenses. Um, when you work hard and you're intelligent and you land a good job, um, they want you. So the employer wants you, and so he's going to offer you things to get you and to keep you. And that's how you get your health insurance, through, you earned it, you know. The concept of giving universal health care to everyone is a bit of a challenge to some of the traditional American values of rugged individualism. Um, and then there's also arguably a lot of people just see big government as inefficient and bureaucratic, which I agree with. Milton Friedman has a good short video. If you ever just do a search on this economist named Milton Friedman and just type in Milton Friedman on big government, and he'll just explain, like in a second, like why big government agencies are a problem. Um, that it's hard to put into words. It's worth pulling up and taking a good look at. But yeah, his name is Milton Friedman, Friedman, Milton, Milton, Milton Friedman, a very famous American economist who's very good at taking complex ideas and really simplifying them down almost to memes, that basically everybody can understand, which I've talked to you guys about before, how important it is to simplify information so that if the dumbest person in the room can understand it, it's effective because it means everyone can understand it.
Oh, that's true. Simple is better. And
Mhm.
now going back to China, Mister, imagine if you like you're president, you're like the leader of the free world. How would you deal with China? Like maybe the way that Reagan dealt with the Soviet Union. What will be like your focus in that, or what? I don't know. What will be your way?
My ways would be very Trumpist. I'd slap a bunch of tariffs on China. I'd tell U.S. companies, I'd put pressure on them to stop sharing their intellectual property with China in order to make short-term profits. Stop shipping manufacturing jobs over there, stop sharing or stop making our technology um, accessible to them, slap a bunch of tariffs on them, um, promote the America First, Made in America movement. And that would sap a lot of China's strength right then and there. In a communist country, uh, with the central government having so much power over everybody, I think it's their number one weakness is creativity and coming up with new things. Um, a lot of their technology and intellectualism is stolen or borrowed, whatever word you want to use. Um, uh, but we make it too easy for them to get access to our technology. And a lot of our trade deals are very one-sided, that we've been letting them get away with it for too long, um, uh, because our corporations are very powerful, and our corporations, American business, American businesses are very, they want results now. They get investors, stockholders, and they have to impress them every quarter. Um, and they need to be able to sit down with the major stockholders and say, since I became chairman of the board, look how much the stock value has gone up. So give me my bonus. And so American businesses, I think, want to make money very fast, and they think very short term. Whereas a more Confucian, like I'll use Japan as an example, um, they're more patient and they will look more at the long term. They're even willing to lose money for a while if they think that in the future, in the long term, it will make money. That's what they do with like dumping. To just briefly describe dumping, um, a Japanese auto manufacturer will say, well, the largest consumer market for automobiles is North America. So we want to start shipping cars or building factories in North America, start selling cars there. But then they'll say, well, we have a lot of competitors. We have Ford, General Motors. How are we going to compete in that market when they already have such strong, well-established automakers? And they'll work with their government, and their government will say, if it costs $1,000 to make a Honda, um, normally you would sell it for $1,200, right? You spend $1,000 making it, and then you sell it for $1,200. You're making $200 of profit. Well, what they'll do is they'll say it's going to cost $1,000 to make a Honda. When we first come into America and start selling it, let's sell our cars for $800. So even though it costs $1,000 to make the car, we're going to sell it for $800. So we're actually going to be losing $200 every time we sell a car. But by selling our car for so cheap, the consumers will switch over to buying our cars, and it will put our competitors out of business. And then once they're all out of business, we don't just raise the price back to 1,000, we raise the price up to 1,600. So for a couple of years, we're actually going to be losing money, but our government will subsidize us while we're losing money. And then once we can take over the market, then we jack up the price again and we pay back the government. That's called dumping. Well, I'm going off onto a different topic, but I want to just link it back to China. American companies, the president or whoever's in charge would need to put more pressure on American companies to stop thinking that it's a good idea give so much of our intellectual property to China and to share it with them in exchange for short-term profits. I would also, with China, I don't like the idea of the United States having lots of permanent overseas alliances. You know from AP US history that traditionally America has been actually an isolationist country that is very wary of permanent international alliances. So on one hand, I want to say a good way to confront China is to strengthen our international alliances with Japan and Taiwan and India, and other countries in that area, South Korea, that feel threatened by China and could work more closely together in a way to sort of contain China, like in the South China Sea and so on. One part of me wants to do that, but then as an American, one part of me also says, wait a minute, then we got to fight other people's wars and, subsidize their militaries and that kind of thing. But I think the just having putting a bunch of tariffs on China essentially trumps ideas about dealing with China are what I would go along with.
No, I understand, and it's a really complex question because
Mhm.
from one side, if you become isolationists, you lose your hard power in the world. You know, like you build this huge castle where you yourself there, and you lose the influence where other countries can go and get them, not like China. But on the other half, like it's obvious that you don't want to become like another Vietnam, no, where you have to fight a proxy war in a country where maybe not shouldn't have been there, but that it doesn't resonate as much to the American public.
It makes other people's drama your drama also.
Aha,
Yeah.
exactly.
And a weak power is more likely to act tough and be stubborn and get into confrontations with people when they know that they have an alliance with a very powerful person.
Mm.
And I use that analogy in our history classes all the time when I talked about foreign relations. Remember what George Washington had said about foreign alliances and that kind of thing. So I have some hesitancy about creating military alliances against China. I would prefer to use more economic methods. Um, just look at something like with NATO, where the United States has been a member of NATO since 1949 and is paying for most of it. And it's just in a momentary crisis that might be okay, but to keep that lasting for decades and decades is not a good policy.
Uh, Going back to history, and what do you think is like the greatest lesson or one of the greatest lessons you've learned from America's past that still resonates with you?
Mm, race is a big issue right now. And so, as it often is in American history, and there's been some historical thinkers recently, an Indian American immigrant from India, who's actually a very smart and historian and understands a lot, has a lot of good insights into American culture and history. His name is Dinesh D'Souza. Um, and when he talks about race in America, he looks at the plantation system from before the Civil War, and he analyzes how plantations were run. And then he looks at how the Black community in the inner cities of America are essentially still run the same way as plantations back before the Civil War. If you need me to explain that a little bit further, I'll just summarize his thesis. His thesis is if you go back and you look at how Southern plantations were run, an old typical cotton plantation in Mississippi, you've got and it's all run by one political party, the Democrats. Okay, because all the Southern plantation owners were Democrats. Okay, he says, look, this is how. Here's what you see on a plantation. You see that violence is used to hold the place together. Okay, there's always a whip hanging on the wall, just as a reminder to the slaves, you better do what you're supposed to do because there's this whip that we're not afraid to use. Um, there's um, there's broken down families, meaning there's kids growing up who don't have fathers. They don't know who their father is. There's a lot of mulattoes walking around. I don't know who my father is. He might, just broken down nuclear families. Dilapidated housing. The slaves' quarters are always very just like the bare essentials. Um, but there's a negative outlook in the sense that this is what life is. There's no way out. This is how it is. And then there's another feature that basic social welfare is provided. So the masters would always justify slavery by saying, Northern abolitionists would criticize Southern slave owners. How could you do that? That's awful. And the slave owners would say, look at how you treat your factory workers. If the economy's not good, you lay off half of your workers. They have no job security. They're out on the street. If a worker, loses his finger in a machine and he's no longer going to be an efficient worker, you lay him off and get rid of him, and he's out on the street. Whereas me, with my workers, with my slaves, I provide them 3 meals a day. That's guaranteed. I provide them their basic housing. It's not great, but it's there. They have housing. They're guaranteed food. If a slave breaks his leg or something, the master will pay to have a doctor come to the plantation and fix his leg. I give all my slaves, an allowance of clothing and shoes every year. So they're getting I'm providing their basic social welfare needs, which is guaranteed. So even in their old age, when they can no longer work anymore, they're still going to get their basic social welfare needs met by me. I'm providing that. And you Northern capitalists, you don't do that. Look at how you treat your factory workers. They have no guarantees as to their basic social welfare needs. And what Dinesh D'Souza says is he says it's still the same system. If you look at America's quote unquote black ghettos or inner cities, you have government subsidized housing. It's called HUD, Housing and Urban Development. You hear of the projects, like some rap song, like I grew up in the projects, life in the projects is tough. That's basic, simple housing. It's not great. There's cockroaches crawling around. Sometimes the plumbing doesn't work and the roof leaks, but the government will basically provide that basic social welfare to people in that situation. Food stamps, a lot of policing is necessary in those areas, stop and frisk, that kind of thing. Broken down families, 70% of Black children grow up in single mother households and don't have fathers around, might not even know who their fathers are. And Dinesh D'Souza basically argues that liberal Democrats or the Democratic establishment that used to run the plantations is still running plantations, but in the inner cities, it has a little bit of a different form, but the same things are in place. We provide the basic social welfare. It's guaranteed to keep them dependent. Instead of picking cotton for us, it's now voting for us. And all the 5 major characteristics of the way plantations were run, you still see those 5 major characteristics when you look at poor Black society in America's inner cities.
And like if you go back, or like you've lived in Detroit your whole life, so you've seen firsthand everything about it. Like if you go back, or if you're in Detroit, is it is it safe? Is it a place where maybe if you're white you should be more careful, like without generalizing, but I
Um, well,
but
I grew up, to be clear, I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit,
okay.
not Detroit itself. Um, when my father was little, um, that's when the Great Migration was still happening. You know, he was born in the 50s and grew up in the late 50s and 60s in Detroit. They were one of the last white families in their neighborhood. Um, yes, that is true. That there are areas where it you would stick out like a sore thumb if you're white, and yes, you would be. Um, Yes, to answer that specific question that you asked, yes, it's certainly still like that in a lot of areas. Repeat your question again because I want to make sure I'm hitting what you asked me.
Sure, like do you still see these things that what the historian, the Indian historian is saying? Do you
Yeah,
see it in your everyday life, or is
yeah.
it more in the projects, more in like specific places?
I mean, certainly America has a strong black middle class. It's there. Um, to think that African Americans are all poor people living in the ghetto is not an accurate statement. The black community has a very successful middle class component and an educated component. Okay. But if you do go to America's inner cities, there are still large areas that are very poor, black, ghetto is the term that's often used. And yes, in those areas, those observations are still true.
You were also I saw and I remember you said that you used to work at the marketing for what was Ford Motor Companies or
It was just a company, it was an advertising agency that specialized in targeting um, Hispanic, African American, Asian, and gay consumer markets. And so we were actually a black owned advertising agency. And basically, to make it simple, our company would go to other companies like Chrysler or Kmart or Verizon Wireless and just say, hey, look, we understand these different minority groups, we understand their mindset, we understand their shopping habits. So if you want to get more customers, hire us, and we're very good at advertising to those specific communities. That was a company that I worked for. Yes.
I guess that it must have been a really, really interesting time for you, know, to see that the different values of
Yes.
different minority groups and what's sticking for them. You know, what's their motivations, or why maybe the black man uses this car, but the Mexican immigrant he likes maybe
We
slow.
did studies on this. This was our job. We did like real scientific academic studies on different groups and what their consumer habits were. And it would of course be wrong to say, well, everyone in this group shops this way or thinks this way. Obviously that would be wrong.
Of course.
But the trend was there. You couldn't deny it. And when we would write up our final reports, we would say that. And so a lot of our observations, when I say what I'm about to say, some people will say, "Oh, that sounds very stereotypical," but we found it to be true. So just I'll talk about black consumers, Hispanic, and Asian consumers. Okay, let's say I want to sell a certain type of car uh, to the black community. We found that if you advertise or you market that car or make a commercial for that car, and you use black actors in the commercial, in that commercial, and a commercial is a story in some ways. So you show, here's this guy Calvin. He recently graduated from college and got his first good job, and now he's ready to buy a car, his first brand new car, and he does it, and now this is proof that he's made it and that he's doing well, and that he's taking it home and driving through his community, and all the girls see him and all the people see him and they're very impressed, and wow, Calvin's got it going on. And overall the message is, look at me, look at my bling bling. And it might sound stereotypical, but we found from our research that that's one of the most successful methods to use when you're advertising in the Black community. It's same automobile, but if you're targeting a Hispanic audience, emphasize how that automobile is good for the whole family,
Mm,
especially and especially appeal to the mother, to the Mexican American mother, and show the family getting up in the morning, and maybe they're a working class family and they've only got one car, but it's this car, and this car is good for the whole family. We drop dad off to work, and then we take the kids to school, and then here comes mom doing all the groceries and the errands with the car during the day, and then she picks up the kids and they're all happy to see mom, and they get in the car, and the car is facilitating the family working together and then going to soccer practice and then coming home at the end of the day to eat dinner. And oh, don't forget to go pick up abuelita and bring her here so she can eat dinner with us. And just how this car is going to support all of your traditional family roles and family values. And take the same car, but if you're trying to reach an Asian audience, you would focus on how this car has great fuel efficiency and works in harmony with the environment, and is also safe. And you almost kind of focus on what you might think of as traditional Confucian values and that kind of thing. Yeah.
okay, Mr. Before we leave, I would love to know who was your favorite president and why.
You know what I'm going to say. My favorite president so far has been Donald Trump. Um, so he's not done. He'll be back. Um, I'm suspicious about the election results of 2020, very suspicious. But I think that Biden is already showing that he's a disaster. Uh, Trump isn't going away. Um, the revolution of 2016 is still here. Um, and besides him, I'd have to say my other favorite presidents would probably be Teddy Roosevelt and George Washington.
Okay, perfect. Mr.
Yes.
So it's been a pleasure having you in this podcast. Mr. Miller scored a perfect 4 out of 4 on his Michigan test for teacher certification, master degree from the New York University Buffalo State in multidisciplinary studies in teacher, over 7 years of teaching just at American schools in Mexico. Mr. It's been a pleasure. And it
Carlos, bef-
always great to see your ideas, your different points of view, and it's refreshing.
thank you. Thank you, Carlos. And it's nice to touch bases with you and see how you're doing. You were always one of my favorite students, and a very studious, high achieving student. And I know you're going to do very well in life. And before we leave, I just wanted to ask, how are things in Mexico with the pandemic right now? Are people all still quarantined and wearing masks, or because things are lightening up here, things are getting back to normal here? How is it over there?
I guess that people are tired in Mexico of the inefficiencies of the government, of the federal government, so to speak. The states, they've been strengthened by this because they know that they can trust the federal system. So that's made each state stronger.
Mhm.
I guess that in Mexico, as we say, right now there's no pandemic in a sense that people are trying to live their lives. They're taking in a pragmatic way that if they get the virus, well, it is what it is, but that won't interfere too with my way of life. And that's
Okay.
how state governments are also seeing it. They're
That's
letting
good. That's
people
good.
just do it. If
Live
they
your life. Yeah.
exactly. So
So that means what? Gyms are back open, and are mask requirements still everywhere? I mean, are people living like hermits? They're not, because
no, no, no.
okay, that's good. That's good. Are people getting the vaccine?
They're getting the vaccine. It depends on the city, I guess. If your mayor is a great one, he or she will get the vaccine and you'll get it. So the richest cities, they're getting it. There's a huge flood of different vaccines, either from China, the Pfizer, the whatever. So right now, one third of the of supposedly of the Mexican population is vaccinated. My parents are already vaccinated, but we still have to wear masks. I'm seeing a lot of foreign immigration back in Mexico because
Oh,
here the it's not that draconian in a way that there you don't have to be at your house every day. So lots of places like Europe, England, Canada, where people need to be isolated or the government is telling them to do, they're going to Mexico just to feel normal again.
well, I would, and Mexico needs that because the tourist industry is so important to the economy, especially in certain cities and states. So it would definitely be in Mexico's interest to allow foreigners in. That's very important, I think. It's a big part of the Mexican economy. Um, I would just leave you with a couple of my thoughts on the pandemic.
Sure.
A lot of things don't add up.
Okay.
A lot of things just don't add up. There's a lot of disinformation going on. I would be very suspicious and very cautious of what the mainstream establishment narratives are about this whole thing. Um, I would just leave you with that. Be very cautious. There's a lot of disinformation happening. Um, I will not get that vaccine. Um,
Okay.
I, I can just tell you right now, there's no reason to. I understand, maybe for older people who have already had kids and, might be in a category where they're more at risk or something, I can understand their desire to get it. Um, uh, if you're young, if you're healthy, I would wait. I would wait and see what happens, because I think as more and more information comes out, you're going to find that there's more and more serious side effects. And well, I won't start getting into conspiracy theories on this, but I will just leave you. Don't believe everything you hear, especially when it comes from the establishment. Um, and there's a lot of funny stuff going on. So, don't rush to go get that vaccine. I would wait. I would
Okay.
wait. Yeah.
Mister, don't leave us like that, please. We love conspiracy theory. If you have at least like one example that so the audience can understand what you're talking about, we can leave it like that and I will appreciate it a lot.
It's experimental. That vaccine is experimental and it does not work the same way that other vaccines work. When a normal vaccine goes into your shoulder, it just stays in that area and your body's antibodies sense that something foreign is there and they travel there to deal with it. This vaccine works very differently. When they inject it into your shoulder, I'm not a doctor, so it's difficult for me to
Yeah.
explain the technicals, but I just know that it works completely differently. And I've knowledgeable people, even the inventor of the MMR vaccine, which is one of the most common vaccines. That's the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. It's a 3-in-1 vaccine. It's very common. Um, one of the most common vaccines in the world. And I just saw an interview with the inventor of that vaccine who was warning people about the COVID vaccine. It works very differently. Um, People are having, pregnant women who are getting it are having a high rate of miscarriages. Um, People are healthy, young people who are getting it. I'm not saying everyone will have a health problem, by no means, but people are getting young healthy people are getting heart attacks within like the same day of getting it. Things like that have happened. um, uh, I don't want to dive too far deep into the conspiracy world. I would just say that I am very suspicious of it. um, uh, you know uh, people who advocate for mass vaccinations also advocate for population control.
Okay.
Uh, uh, if you look at some of the things that Bill Gates and some of these other people are into, it will turn you white. So just I making people panic is a good way to get them to do certain things that they would not normally do, like surrendering some of their rights and that kind of thing. And just a lot of things smell very fishy. And I'll leave it at that. I don't know. I saw something people in Mexico the other day were doing the magnet test. Did you see the magnet test?
No, I didn't.
Where when people who have gotten the vaccine, if you go up to their shoulder with a magnet and put it on their shoulder, a lot of people have gotten the vaccine, the magnet stays there. You haven't seen this on Mexican social media?
No, but I'll try.
No, you should look it up. The magnet test for people who have gotten the vaccine, like weird things, just weird things. Dr. Fauci, I don't know how, you guys know who Dr. Fauci is. Do people?
Of course.
Okay. That guy is a liar. He should be arrested. He's the one who was actually facilitating the funding of the Wuhan lab. That this was, what's the word for it? There's a special phrase that they use, but this virus research was actually, they were looking for ways to make viruses more transmissible and weaponized. He was in charge of funding this Wuhan lab. And he denied it. And a lot of his emails have been, leaked recently. And a lot of things that he was saying earlier in the pandemic, it's turning out he was lying. So just there's a lot of disinformation. People with bad agendas, I believe, are trying to take advantage of this crisis to implement their goals. So just be careful. Don't always drink the Kool-Aid. Use your common sense.
I'll keep a weary eye, mister. Thank
Yep.
you again very much again for your time. Have a
Mhm.
great day, and
Mhm.
you're always invited to the program, mister.
Thank you very much. I like being here, and it was nice to see you, Carlos.
Likewise. Have a great day.
Okay. God bless you.
Likewise. Bye.
All right. Goodbye.